But very excited for today's keynote address, which I'll say more about in just a moment here. But I should say, while we're convening here, feel free to get up and grab more food. This will be very informal, and we have plenty of it. One more logistical note, we're going to be sending around an email sign-up list for the Anselm House mailing list. Anselm House is the convener of this symposium. We are a Center for Christian Study here at the University of Minnesota. If you're not already on our list, you'll want to get on that list so you can find out about more opportunities like this. If you are on the list, still put your name down because we're going to give away, Casey, how many copies?
We're going to give away two. One is Soul Wine, one is Spirituality.
One of each of Dr. Kreglinger's books. So even if you're already on our list, go ahead and update your information there, and we'll do a book giveaway at the end of this time. I should also mention that we have Dr. Kreglinger's books for sale at the table in the back. So even if you're unfortunate and don't win the lottery, you can still purchase one. We also have a number of free resources back there, including our Between Cities Student Journal. We've got multiple issues there around faith and agriculture that you'll want to take a look at. And Dr. Christopher Thompson from St. Paul Seminary is here joining us as part of the symposium. He has his book, The Joyful Mystery, back there for sale as well. So check out the table and take resources with you. So when we were thinking about keynote addresses as part of this symposium, Dr. Kreglinger quickly came to the top of our list of possible speakers that we would like to invite to be part of this symposium, really because of her expertise in this intersection between Christian theology, Christian spirituality, and questions of food and agriculture. Just to give you a sense of her background, her credentials in these areas, she has a PhD in historical theology from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. She's taught theology at Samford University as well as University of Alabama at Birmingham. And her first book, which again is available at the back table, The Spirituality of Wine.
Second book.
Second book. Second book is The Spirituality of Wine is a scholarly investigation of the place of wine in the Christian tradition and how the Christian spiritual and theological resources help us kind of imagine wine and understand wine. It has fantastic endorsements. If you kind of follow this food and faith theology conversation at all, Norman Wiersbe from Duke endorsed the book, and then wide-rangingly sort of different worlds, Alice Waters in the slow food movement has also endorsed the book. So very strong.
And they're not Christians.
Endorsements for this. That's right. Her other book, The Soul of Wine, Savoring the Goodness of God, is, again, at that back table, and that's really unpacking this idea of savoring, which if you were at the wine tasting last night, we talked a lot about. So I would commend both of those books to you. Just as important, though, in terms of her theological training for this conversation, I think, is the fact that she has a lived background in agriculture. So she comes from a family-owned winery in Franconia, Germany. She grew up on a winery. And that lived experience of winemaking, I think, very much informs your approach to this topic, that it's not just a sort of theoretical conversation, but it's very much grounded in lived experience. And I think, again, if you were able to make it to wine tasting, we felt that, I think, in the way that you approached wine and led us into wine last night. So for those reasons, just the expertise as well as the personal appreciation, we were very excited to invite you and so glad that you accepted the invitation. For today's keynote, we've asked Dr. Kreglinger to share with us reflections on the role of technology in winemaking. As sort of a window into bigger questions around technology, agriculture, and the Christian tradition. So again, we're going to sort of use winemaking and technology as a lens into some bigger conversations, which we've already begun this morning. It came up a couple of times. How do we think about technology in the agricultural world? And I think it's going to continue after lunch. But I'm excited that this is going to provide us some resources to continue to engage those questions. So Dr. Kreglinger, thank you so much for being with us today. Would you all help me welcome her here to the University of Minnesota?
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Anselm House and the Anselm community, and I understand there is a wonderful community that makes it possible for you to have these events, and it's a great honor for me to be here and to speak to you. And I'm also very, very grateful to you that you are facilitating a conversation around a Christian perspective on agriculture in higher education. I teach a class on the spirituality of food at a secular university. And so the questions are very existential for me, and I feel like I'm sort of on my own, tucked away. So to be suddenly part of this great community, I'm like, oh, wow, they all speak my language. This is really great. Wow, I'm not alone in this. So thank you so much. I feel very grateful to be part of this conversation, and it is such an important conversation for our time. So I will be talking about technology, spirituality, and wine. Really as a window into these larger questions and conversations we're having. I will also, as we talk about wine and agriculture and theology, I will also make those connections to agriculture more widely speaking, so that you don't feel like it's just a small world of wine, which is actually not very small, and it's exploding in the USA and is a massive economic force now here. But before I dive into it, I do want to reflect very briefly about my own life growing up on a winery. I've been exposed to agriculture, the question of technology and wine from a very early age. So here is a picture of me at the bottom of a vineyard in a tomato field. And my mom used to be going out into the fields with everyone else, and so we were shuffled along. And that's where I spent my days as a child when it wasn't raining. When it was raining, I had to sit with my grandfather in the office, and that was not very fun. But I grew up with my family around the lunch table, always discussing. My parents, we weren't really allowed to talk. We were just sort of there. They were listening to the radio. They were listening to the weather. And they made decisions every day about what to do in the vineyard, what technology to use, how to sort of maneuver the different climates. And so that was my lunch experience every day, except on Sunday. So, but that's how I grew up. And my family had to make a lot of choices about using technology. And one of them, I wanted to just give you an example of how difficult those decisions are, is in the springtime when the vines start to bud, and then there comes a cool front and frost. It can destroy the whole harvest in one night. In the 70s was a time when Franconia is a very cool region, and so wine growing had become very, very difficult. And to lose another harvest would probably have been the end for my family, financially speaking. So when the frost came, and we knew it was coming, my family gathered all of our relatives together, all the people from the village, and they started to put barrels of oil into the vineyards and lit them, so that at night the vines and the butts would be protected and not be frozen. This is my mom and my grandmother in the work of using very environmentally unfriendly technology to save our harvest. But it meant that we could go on. And so that's sort of an image of what it looks like when in the springtime they had to light those barrels with oil to make sure that we could protect the vineyard. And so I grew up in this tension of a family that needed to make a livelihood, and making a livelihood as a farmer is very hard. It's very, very hard work. And using technology that sometimes isn't the best for the environment. Of course, nowadays they have different kind of technology to take care of problems like that. We don't do that anymore. But when I was a child, this is what we did. And then I also grew up in the Christian faith. This is the Lutheran church that my family attends and has been attending for generations. We actually became Lutheran when our local prince decided he wanted to become Lutheran in the early 17th century. So this Catholic church turned Lutheran. This is where me and my ancestors have worshipped for many, many generations. And my family has been making the wine for the Eucharist for many generations. So our life on the winery and our life of faith were always connected, though I didn't understand it as a child very well. And I remember when I took my first communion in the Lutheran church, you get confirmed when you're 14, and that's back then, that's when you were allowed to take communion for the first time. And, it's a very big thing in the Lutheran Church. You had 2 years of preparation, and you had to memorize all of these things. And so to actually sort of go and be in front of the congregation and get confirmed was a really big thing. And then when I took communion and I took the cup and I smelled it, I was shocked because I smelled home. I smelled the wine that my family had made. And it was it took me aback because I thought, oh, wow, these two spheres are connected. What we do on the winery, as hard and as messy as it is, somehow is connected to my faith. And perhaps God's redemption is not just between me and God. It's not just about me and my sort of struggles and sin and whatever. This is actually connected to all that we do on the winery and all the hardship and all the tragic stories that are connected to that. And I wasn't able to put into words then what I was sensing and the revelation that I had, but it sort of followed me, and this urge grew in me to become a theologian. And it was growing up on a winery, and then that my family would make wine for the Eucharist. Like, that's where God meets us, and we make that? How can that be? So, that's sort of the background of growing up on a winery, growing up in the Lutheran faith, and that has profoundly shaped what I do today. My title is Technology, Spirituality, and Wine, and I will begin by reflecting on the theme of wine and agriculture in the Bible. And I will follow that up with some general reflections on technology. And then I will discuss the more destructive forces or destructive use of technology in agriculture, how to understand that with a theological category of sin, followed by reflections on the vintner as a practical and practicing theologian. What can vintners do to become part of what I call redemptive agricultural practices? And I'll have a short conclusion and then hopefully lots of time to engage with you all. So let's start with wine and agriculture in the biblical vision. Wine and the vine are the most talked about food in the Bible. There are nearly 1,000 references to wine and wine-related themes. A German vintner in theology PhD did a dissertation on that, who actually understands the language in the Bible and teased it all out. Unfortunately, no one really references it, but the theme is very, very important in the Bible. And this theme of wine and agriculture is profoundly woven into the redemptive narrative between God and his people in the land. It's not just sort of an added, well, let's have a little party and drink. No, it's part of God's redemptive purposes. Noah is the first one to plant a vineyard in the Bible. And wine is singled out as a gift from God that he blesses people and nations with, so that they in turn can become a blessing. When Isaac speaks his blessing over Jacob, he says, quote, "May God give you of the dew of heaven, of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine." End of quote. This is from Genesis 27:28. The psalmist praises wine as a harbinger of joy. That's Psalm 104. When the Israelites arrive at the border of the promised land, they bring back a huge grape cluster from the valley of Eschol. That's Hebrew for the valley of the grape cluster. And that indicates to Moses and God's people that this land surely is a land flowing with milk and honey. So God's provision for his people always includes a land rich in agriculture. I'm just jumping from big themes to the next, and you can I have lined that out in the spirituality of wine. I take a whole chapter, and even that is just very brief. But at least you get a glimpse for how rich this theme is in the Bible. The latter prophets like Hosea, Amos, and Joel speak of God's future redemption when he will send a Messiah, and there will be feasting and wine flowing in great abundance. That's one of the signs that God's Messiah has come. Think about that. Is that what we sort of learn in our Bible studies about when the Messiah comes? That there will be feasting and abundance of wine? I've never heard that before. So when Jesus performs his first miracle at the wedding feast of Cana in turning water reserved for the rite of purification into an abundance of wine, he gives the first sign that indeed he is the Messiah. Wine becomes a symbol that the Messiah is here, that the Messiah has come. That's in the Bible. When Jesus celebrates the Last Supper with his disciple, he blesses one of the 4 cups that were drunk during the Passover meal and offers it to his disciples, saying, "The blood of the covenant." Wine consecrated and offered up in the Eucharist lifts this precious gift of wine to the highest spiritual realm, where believers are forgiven, healed, and renewed, and can enjoy communion with God. Wine therefore becomes a carrier and a symbol for the divine mysteries. In the traditional liturgy of the Eucharist, the Reformers deleted that for various reasons. In the liturgy, they still pray in some traditions, quote, "the fruit of the vine and work of human hands," referring to the wine in the Eucharistic cup. It emphasizes that wine is both a gift from God and a collaboration between God, nature, and human craftsmanship. It lifts the whole realm of agriculture into the spiritual realm. And at least for us Lutherans, Anglicans, Episcopalians, Catholics, wine becomes the place where Christ is truly present and where we encounter him. Not just as an idea, but a real living presence coming to us in bread and wine. Think about that. We think a lot about the theological arguments surrounding that, but think about that God comes to us in bread and wine. Wine also plays an important role in God's future. At the Last Supper, Jesus proclaims, quote, "I tell you, I will never again drink of this fruit of the vine until that day, when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." Wine foreshadows the eschatological wedding feast. Very short overview, but in the Bible, wine is a divine gift and blessing, mediates God's redemptive presence to us in the Eucharist, and is a harbinger of joy and expectant hope for God's future kingdom. It is a really rich theme in the Bible. So therefore, when we drink wine, how vintners craft wine, how they use technology is not only a matter of agriculture, cost-effective production, marketing, and perhaps personal preference. It is a profoundly spiritual and theological affair meant to honor God and his beautiful creation, and our collaborative work with him in growing grapes and in crafting wine. That is a spiritual vocation. It matters spiritually. And in this broken world, this means that the crafting of wine and agriculture, more generally speaking, is meant to contribute to the healing and redemption of God's creation. And it's here that the question of the role of technology must be asked, I think. What role should technology have in making wine and agriculture, more generally speaking? What does the use of agriculture reveal about a vintner's or a farmer's values and belief systems? Where are the boundaries and limits in using technology? So let's move on to talk about technology. Is it a blessing or a curse? Technology is a hotly debated issue in our time. We now live in a technological age where the rapid development of technology has dramatically changed not only our lives as human beings, but also the natural world around us and how we relate to the natural world. Scientists now speak of the Anthropocene age, where human activity and our extensive and unbridled use of modern technology has been a dominant influence on climate and the environment. And this is often, not always, but often accompanied by massive environmental degradation. The exploitation of natural resources, environmental pollution, the collapse of ecosystems, and the extinction of species, resulting in food injustice and food insecurity around the world. Pope Francis in Laudato Si calls the earth, quote, burdened and laid waste, the most abandoned and maltreated of the poor, end of quote. So our unreflected and unrestrained use of modern technology, some modern technology, has an enormous role in our ability to exploit and maltreat the earth. So it's a difficult issue to talk about. The rise of social media and its impact on our society is another hotly debated issue of our time. So given all of this, I want to take a step back and ask more fundamentally, what is technology? Is it really all bad? The English term technology derives from the Greek words technologia and techne, dealing with the knowledge, discourse, and study of arts and crafts. The Greek term techne usually translates as art, craft, or skill. We all have to draw on techne, and all civilizations of the world have made use of various techne to work the land, to build houses, and employed it in their various crafts in the making of art. Technology in this very fundamental sense, in and of itself, is not bad or destructive. But the environment and the cultural context in which we use and develop technology has made certain kinds of technology incredibly destructive to human life and God's creation, more widely speaking. From a Christian perspective, technology in its most fundamental sense as techne is profoundly linked to human creativity. As Christians, we believe that we are made in the image of God. Being creative is one of our most fundamental callings as creatures of God. God whom we worship as the creator of this amazing world that we live in. So our capacity for creativity is therefore a gift from God, and our development and use of techne is a divine calling. It's not sort of a neutral or a secular realm. For us Christians, it means we're called to this. So I just want to give you a very simple use of technology. This is a vintner's knife. This is from Roman times. It was discovered along the Mosel River in Germany. This is what it looked like. This is the technology that they invented to prune vines, and it made things a lot easier. And then look at the vintner's knife today. In many ways, the shape is still the same. Of course, the technology is a lot more advanced and it's easier to use on the hand. But we still have to do it all manually if you want to do it well. So this is a wonderful invention of technology, and it's been developed, and it has been a great blessing in the wine world. Thinking about technology is not a sort of modern thing. I think it has intensified it because of the sort of limits of technology, and we realize there's a lot of destructiveness going on. But in the 6th century, a theologian thought about technology, and his name is Saint Benedict. And he reflected on technology when he wrote his great rule for his monks and nuns, whom he expected to do manual labor. And so this is what he wrote. Regard all utensils and goods of the monastery as sacred vessels for the altar. Basically, he said, use all techne in light of your calling to worship God and honor his creation. So the vintner and all those working in agriculture have a unique vocation. How a vintner crafts wine and what technology she or he uses is therefore not a secular matter, but part of his divine calling to reveal the goodness and generosity of our Creator and to be part of God's redemptive healing presence in the world. So having said a few general things about technology, I do want to move now to what I call the curse of technology and the vintner as a practical theologian. Perhaps we can see the wine world as a microcosm for the greater struggles and questions going on in our contemporary globalized agricultural landscape. The 20th century saw the rise of industrial agriculture, putting an abundance of technological tools at the hand of farmers and vintners, including the invention of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides that are in heavy use all over the world. They also destroy the rich microbial population in the soil and the natural yeast organisms in the vineyard that help start fermentation of the harvested grape juice. So with so much life in the soil destroyed, the vintner now has to apply synthetic fertilizers to provide additional nutrients to help vines grow and increase crop yield. As one producer of synthetic fertilizers wrote, quote, "The use of fertilizers is all about efficiency, maximizing crop yield," end of quote. So the heavy use of synthetic fertilizers ensures high productivity, but it leaves the soil barren and the food that is grown in it without the rich nutrients that only a healthy and vibrant soil provides. The decrease of nutrients in our food is a major challenge to human health. The seeming abundance in our supermarket aisles hides the scarcity of lack of nutrients in our food, and the nutritional value of our food has consistently gone down. In the wine world, these practices are mostly done by corporate wineries, whose end goal is to produce a cheap generic wine with little care for either the land or the idea that wine should reflect place, the place that it comes from, and help us connect to this place. And also to inspire drinkers with its beauty and finesse towards wonder and awe. And we have lost that sense of wonder and awe in the wine and food world in many, many areas. So there's little room in this sort of, with these corporate wineries for beauty, surprise, wonder, mystery, in these generic wines. I mean, you can get very decent wines at Trader Joe's, but if they stir in you a sense of wonder or surprise, I doubt that. I think they're nice drinking wines, but they don't do what a wine can do. And I would say and argue that this is really a demystified world where all is geared towards efficiency, productivity, and profit for the corporations that set the agendas. Carl Mitchum, a philosopher of technology, describes our society as, quote, dominated by technical or instrumental rationality, strongly utilitarian in its cultural basis, end of quote. No sense for wonder and awe and surprise. So this utilitarian approach is having devastating consequences, not only for the environment, but also on human health in general. And I would argue for our spiritual lives as well. So the heavy use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides in agriculture, more generally speaking, often goes hand in hand with the cultivating of monocultures and intensified farming practices that have led to the loss of soil fertility and organic matter, the loss of soil biodiversity, the salinization through using acid-forming fertilizers, and the loss of nutrients in our foods. In addition, this is a very complex subject matter that are feeding into this. There a lot of other factors like mining, industrial pollution, urban expansion, overgrazing, deforestation, and the long-term climate change that have had a disastrous effect on the world's arable farmland. According to the United Nations report, almost a third of the world's farmable land has disappeared in the last 4 decades. All of the world's topsoil could become unproductive within 60 years if we continue with these practices and current loss continues. I've been trying to find some current maps on desertification. Can someone say that for me? Desertification maps of the world. So I found one that's quite dated from the United States Department of Agriculture that was last updated in 2003. And so it's those red marks that show the desertification vulnerabilities. But as I said, that's a very dated map. Then I pulled up another one that shows the advance of desertification in the world, but I couldn't date it. And then what I did come across is the World Atlas of Desertification that is brought out by the European Union. And so it's a big subject matter and a pressing issue of our time. And it's not something new. The world has always struggled with this. But the speed by which we use fertile soil is mind-boggling, and I find that quite terrifying. So I think that's, I don't know if we have any soil scientists in the room. Yeah, so maybe afterwards we can talk a little bit about that from sort of someone who has studied that more in detail. But I wanted to introduce you to a book that I use for my students by David Montgomery. It's called Dirt to the Erosion of Civilizations. And he looks at this problem from a historical perspective. This is not something new. Civilizations in the history of humanity have used intensified agricultural practices. And then the loss of soil fertility eventually led to the decline of these civilizations. So this is what this book is about, and there is also a chapter on the Dust Bowl disaster in the USA. But it just gives you a historical perspective, shows you that it's not really a new theme, but because of the technology that we have intensified that problem, and I think we really need to think hard about that. So we do need to have farming practices that help heal and regenerate the soil to ensure that future generations can continue to grow food to feed their families. And this is why the term regenerative agriculture is now in popular use. These are farmers who are trying to not just sort of not leach the soil of nutrients, but actually heal the soil. I think that's a big part of regenerative agriculture. Before I introduce you to some vintners who have made this turn towards regenerative agriculture that seeks to heal the soil, I would like to reflect on the destructive use of technology from a theological perspective. How do we understand that theologically? So I would like to explore the more destructive forces in using technology in light of the fall as described in Genesis, both to see what is lost but also to see what needs to be regained. I love this tapestry from England of the Garden of Eden because it just shows that abundance and that diversity in the Garden of Eden. In the creation account, we learn that God, like a gardener, plants a garden in Eden. And Eden literally means a garden of pleasure and delight, where humans live in harmony with God, each other, and humans get to enjoy the fruit of this lush and bountiful garden. All the trees are, quote, pleasant to the sight and good for food, end of quote. There is a great sense of abundance, diversity, fruitfulness that flows directly from the life of God, and that humans get to enjoy literally by eating the fruits of this garden. It is an agricultural reality as much as it is a spiritual vision. The Garden of Eden represents the spiritual realm of life. And the tree of life in it represents God's presence, his reign, in the spiritual order and rhythm that enables the flourishing all of life as God designed it. So the Garden of Eden is full of trees that bear fruit for humans to enjoy. And this sense of abundance, diversity, and culinary delights is a spiritual gift to humanity. And this is the world that God has made for humans to enjoy, spiritually, emotionally, and physically. There is no distinction here. The spiritual realm is profoundly embedded in the natural world, and our ability to savor food is part of what it means to be a spiritual being. So when we look at industrial agriculture, including the wine world, and what it has done to this bountiful and diverse world, then we need to identify that it has reduced it to just a handful of varieties that now make up the main crops that we grow on a large scale. In the wine world, we have reduced this great abundance to just a few popular grape varieties, often produced in such homogeneous ways that a Cabernet Sauvignon from South Africa, South America, or the south of France tastes very similar. There's no diversity, there's no sense of bounty, it's all the same generic drink. Think about it. There are only a handful of grape varieties that you can usually find in the supermarket shelves. Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Gris, Riesling. We had some of them yesterday. Pinot Noir, Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon. Old wine regions are pulling out lesser-known varieties in order to please the fast-changing popular taste of the global wine market. And there's a great loss of these older grape varieties that speak of an abundance and a creativity in humans developing agriculture in the wine world over thousands of years. Michael Pollan, in his book, The Botany of Desire, recounts the rise and fall of the apple diversity in the USA. He writes, "Thousands of apple traits and the genes that code those traits have become extinct as the vast flowering of apple diversity that Johnny Appleseed sponsored has been winnowed down to a small handful of varieties that can pass through the needle's eye of our narrow conception of sweetness and beauty." We can see similar developments with the growing of grain, of corn, of bananas, and the list could just go on. The homogenization of life, the lack of diversity we see in the food world today eclipses the sense of bounty and beauty and diversity that reveals to us something about God's superabundant life and generosity. It's a great loss and eclipses our vision of God and the fullness of life that he wants to impart to us. The spiritual realm that we might experience within us or in our community is reflected in the abundance of what nature brings. We are part of that same created world. When Jesus performed his first miracle and transformed water into choice wine, this choice wine revealed something about who God is and the abundant and beautiful life that he wants to give to us. The spiritual life is not detached from the physical world, but profoundly embedded in it. When the food world is marked by a lack of diversity, flavor, and nutrients, then it reduces our vision of who God is and eclipses the generosity that he placed into creation. Well, the other tree that I haven't mentioned yet is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. From this tree, humans were not meant to eat. It is the forbidden fruit, and eating from it means spiritual death. And Norman Wurzbach argues this tree represents the capacity for the making and keeping of boundaries. To transgress them is to do evil. To keep those boundaries is to do good. To have no bounds is to be like God. Boundaries are an important part of the creation account. The Garden of Eden is an enclosed space with boundaries, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil further establishes boundaries that humans are not to meddle with. They are to keep away from them and respect them. The Garden of Eden, the spiritual realm that includes the material world, has boundaries that God has placed there. With these boundaries, life can flourish as God meant it. The rhythm of the natural world as we experience them are the rhythms and the natural boundaries that God placed into his creation. In Genesis, God places humans in the garden to till and keep it. And this includes respect not only for what God has made, but also the boundaries he placed there. The boundaries protect and preserve this life. So our role as humans is to respect, to keep, and protect these very boundaries. When humans transgress these boundaries and lose respect for them, we will become destructive, not only to ourselves, but also to the world at large. Now, let me insert that that's not usually how the creation account is interpreted. Most theologians have never worked on a farm. They're not agrarian people. They go to high school, then they go to college, then they go to university, then they go to a theological seminary, and they're absolutely, their vision is part of a trajectory that has been detached from agriculture for hundreds of years. So the reading, an agrarian reading of the creation account is something that people are now recovering. And so you have to imagine that the people that first read or heard that account were agrarian people. And so they had a very different vision. So I just wanted to insert that when you read commentaries, that might not be how people interpret the creation account. But I think it's a very important way to view it. So the lack of boundaries is something I think that we see today in industrial agriculture. We no longer respect the natural boundaries that God has placed into his creation. And with the help of modern technology, we push against it, exploit the natural world without respecting the rhythm by which the earth renews itself in the limited resources we have. So the loss of topsoil is one good example. It's limited, and it only renews itself slowly. When we use agricultural practices that deplete the soil, rather than regenerate it on such a large scale, we transgress the God-given boundaries and sin against God and future generations who will no longer be able to grow food and feed their families. So we sin against future generations. And it's here that I want to introduce the vintner as a practical and practicing theologian. For my book, The Spirituality of Wine, the second part of this book is called Sustainability. It's asked a lot of questions about what does it mean to be sustainable in the agricultural world, but also in the church as we think about how we consume. And so for this book, I interviewed about 30 vintners in Europe and in North America. And 2 of them are biodynamic vintners. And biodynamic winemaking is very similar to regenerative agriculture, but has a strong spiritual and philosophical undercurrent to it, and that goes back to Rudolf Steiner. Are you familiar with Rudolf Steiner and his essays on agriculture? From Germany. We're haunted by him. We think he is weird. My family doesn't like biodynamic agriculture, but I find it fascinating. And so I want to introduce you to 2 of them. One of them is Michel Lafarge from Burgundy in France. This is father and son, senior and junior, and so I interviewed junior. And they're Catholic vintners whose faith shapes the way they do agriculture. And when they went to university, they learned industrial agricultural practices. And they saw how chemical and synthetic fertilizers destroyed the microorganisms that exist in the vineyard. And Michel Lafarge argues that a winemaker that uses that exerts a position of control over the vineyard when he uses them. The posture of the winemaker is always against something, against nature, against illness, against problems. It's a relationship of power and opposition towards the vineyard. Lafarge believes that we live in a world based on fear, and that informs our training and education. Lafarge now works with creation and its rhythms and boundaries. Nature, he says, is alive, and he wants to understand the living organisms in his care and what it means to work with them. He's inspired by the Cistercian monks, who first planted vineyards in Burgundy and had a sense of terroir. The monks of old, and I write about them too, they discerned places that I thought that were really good for growing grapes or certain kind of grapes. And a lot of the Grand Crus and the best wines of the world come from these sites that go back to these monks. So he said some really interesting things about these monks. He says, and my family, we're very German and rational, so my father shook his head when he said that. But Lafarge believes that the work and the prayers of the Cistercians still affects his life and work today. He feels, he senses the prayers in the soil. For Lafarge, the well-being of the vine in the vineyard is directly linked to the loving posture that he has towards his vines. It's important to him to go to the vines often, to feel the vines, to stay connected with them, and to learn what they need. In a world that is based on fear rather than love, Lafarge works hard at being loving towards his vines and not acting out of a sense of fear. He believes that this posture of love helps the vines to flourish and produces a wine that is vibrant. And he feels that the vines sense that. He has that sort of a connection with them. So to me, when I listened to it, at first I was just like, ooh, I wonder what my father would say to that. But Lafarge, I think, stepped out of the modern utilitarian mindset that sees the natural world as a mere commodity that we can use for our utilitarian and short-sighted purposes. For Lafarge, his vineyard is part of the great community of creation. It has its own rhythms and life, and his vocation is to respect this life and cultivate it with love and care. He's a very, very respected vigneron in Burgundy. So they live off the land, it's hard work, but the whole of Burgundy, because of people like Michel Lafarge and Aubert de Villane, who is anyone who is in the wine world, if he gets to have a minute with Aubert de Villane, will consider himself really, really blessed. But those two have pioneered biodynamic viticulture in Burgundy, and that whole area is turning at least organic. It's really incredible, and people flock to that area. It's a fascinating place to be. My father would have some questions about some of how the marketing world uses the talk, that spiritual talk, and how appealing that is. And there's actually a sociologist called Marion de Mossier, who's also from Burgundy, but she teaches in the UK, and she has some harsh words to say. But I'm admitting this is a complex reality. It's not easy. Here is another biodynamic vintner I interviewed, and he is from California, Ted Lemon. He has a vineyard in Sonoma. As a wonderful, wonderful person to talk to. He was profoundly influenced by how viticulture is done in Burgundy. So he went to Burgundy, worked there, learned, and then went back to the US. He used to farm conventionally for 20 years before turning to biodynamic farming, which is a kind of regenerative farming, practice, but as I said, it has a spiritual undercurrent that my family makes some very cutting remarks about, let's put it that way. But I think it's very important to understand that the world is a spiritual world, and the soil and the vineyard and vines, they're not just things, they are spiritual beings. So Ted Lemon is very well acquainted with the use of modern technology in farming. And he believes that the bottom line, modern technology has three outcomes. It makes one's job easier, it costs less money, and it has the more hidden consequence that one will have to spend less time on the farm. He left conventional agriculture because of the destructiveness it caused, and he could no longer live with it, he said to me. He wanted to do farming that brought healing and life back to the soil, and where he got to work more intimately with the land. Lemon believes that place is not merely a question of physical matter, but is a living and spiritual reality. He believes that humans have a unique capacity to bring those, the material and the spiritual, together as they work the land. So really he believes that a vintner or a farmer has actually a very spiritual vocation in bringing heaven and earth together. He believes that certain sites have spiritual dispositions which allow them to create great wines, which in turn creates a spiritual reaction within us. And I think that's true. Some wines, they're so beautiful that you just have this sense of awe and wonder. And I noticed that in the wine world, people who enjoy wines and they suddenly are in this place of awe and wonder, but they don't know to whom they are to direct this to. To whom do we direct this awe and wonder? They're like, oh, how can that be? How can that be that some soil, vines, and weather and climate can produce something like this? They're in complete awe of that. And I think that's why wine is such an important theme in the Bible. It creates that sense of wonder and awe and lifts our spirit. So Ted Lemon uses as little invasive technology as possible because for him, every piece of technology functions like a filter on a camera lens. The more filters we use, the more the vineyard recedes into the background until ultimately the taste of place itself disappears and our connection with the land is lost. And I think this is a really great loss indeed. I can't tell you how many people come to our winery. They come from the city, they come to the tasting room, and they tell us about this wine, tell us about the soil. They long for a connection with the land. So many people live such uprooted lives, and they want that connection. And I think that's really important for us spiritually. That, you know, even as I sort of came here by the grace of God, God put a person beside me on the airplane who is from Minnesota, and she is part of a farming, you know, they have farms, and they are in this community to endorse regenerative agriculture. But she told me to go to a restaurant called Owamni. I don't know how many of you know that restaurant, but it was a spiritual experience. I did. I arrived late that night, got up in the morning from a hotel, walked, hit a couple museums, walked up there, and I got into that restaurant, and it was absolutely incredible. And I didn't know that, but St. Anthony's Falls, that's not the historical name. The historical name is Owamni, and that's where the Indians would come. It was a very spiritual place for them. And I just felt, oh, wow, there are people who understand this spiritual connection to the land, to what we eat. And I just felt like I was in this, it was such a gift to be able to experience that because I felt like I'm in Minnesota. I get to experience the history. I get to experience the whole narrative. And some of it is hard, but we are in the business of redeeming history. That's what God wants to do. And I think this is what farmers are called to do. They are in the business of redeeming. We are part of God's redemption. And I live in Birmingham, Alabama. And so I teach a class on the spirituality of food, so I had to do a lot of research. So I came across this family. They are from Coleman, Carl, Carly, Claire, and Kate. And they're all farmers, and they're from Heritage Hill Farmstead, and they do regenerative agriculture. I've tried to get him to speak in my class twice. The first time he had COVID, and I had pneumonia, so the class didn't happen at all. The second time, one of his cows was giving birth to a calf, and it didn't go well, so he had to stay on the farm, and he couldn't come. But I've been in contact with them, and they do regenerative agriculture. The story is that she had an autoimmune disease, and she was very, very ill. And so they decided to become farmers. He's actually from Canada. And they moved to Coleman, and they now do regenerative agriculture. They are beyond organic. Their pigs are forest foraged. Look at them. So this is just an example, of a place like Alabama where I moved, which is unbelievably rich in agriculture. In Birmingham, where I live, the wine and food world is amazing, much better than where I'm from in Germany. So it's just to give you a sense for that this movement of regenerative agriculture is here. You might be more familiar with Gabe Brown. He is a regenerative farmer. I don't know him and his work. I haven't researched it, but a friend of mine said, he's more well known. I know Carl and Carly. They're my friends now, and I know what they do, and it's very encouraging. The vintners and the farmers are our practical and practicing theologians, and are truly mediators between heaven and earth as they bring healing to the soil, keep animals in ways that honor God and His design, and ultimately they bring healing to us as human beings. Carly is thriving now. She was very ill. They've completely changed the way they eat. And so she's an amazing testimony to the healing power of wholesome food. So let me say a few words in conclusion. The creation account teaches us that we commune with God and each other through the world that God has made. The more we distance ourselves from it, the more we distance us from God. We must relearn how to use technology wisely and use it in such a way as to heal the earth, regenerate our soils, and bring nourishment and healing to our bodies and our communities. Wine and food are meant to reveal to us something about the benevolence and generosity of our Creator God. Therefore, the vintner and the farmer have priestly vocations to mediate between heaven and earth. By working with the gift and the rhythms and the boundaries of creation, they are to offer up what they harvest as sacrifice that help heal the wounds of the world, not least of them the earth itself, whom Pope Francis calls, quote, burdened and laid waste, the most abandoned and maltreated of the poor, end of quote. So let us make wine and bread again that is worthy to instill in us the hope and joy-filled anticipation of the great eschatological wedding feast between God and His people. And may the choice wine we drink give us a foretaste of all the spiritual bounty that we taste from the tree of life, whose leaves are for the healing of the nations. For those of you who'd like to learn more about that and sort of trace the agricultural history of Christianity and the spirituality of wine and food, I do take once a year a group to Burgundy, where Benedictines and Cistercian monks developed agriculture throughout Europe and laid the foundation for Western civilization to emerge. It's an unbelievable story that has not been told. I was quite disappointed when Pope Francis, in his essay on creation care, what is it called? Laudato Si. When he was, and he's named after St. Francis, but St. Francis didn't do any agriculture. St. Francis let go of all wealth and begged. And the people that really worked with creation in a sustainable way were the Cistercians. And I think from them we can learn a lot. But because theologians aren't or haven't been interested in agriculture, people haven't written and researched about that. So I take people on these pilgrimages. So if you're interested, you can let me know. And I think that's the last thing that I wanted to say. I did bring some books, and sometimes what gets lost in my book is the second part of this book is all about sustainability. Not just sustainable agriculture, but also sustainable living. For example, addiction is a massive problem today. It was before COVID, and it will continue that way, and it's a massive problem. It's not just an individual problem. There are systemic problems in our society that have moved us towards addictive behaviors, but also to develop a sustainable spirituality. So I encourage you to pick up the book and to think about sustainability, not just in agriculture, but how that has to be rethought in our society at large. So thank you so much for your patience. I am so grateful that I get to be with you, and I hope that this has raised some questions. These are hotly debated issues. They are not easy. The answers won't be easy, and I think that we have constructive conversation is a big step in the right direction. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gisela. We've got about 10 minutes for questions and discussion.
Yes.
I know there's obviously not a simple answer to this question,
Yeah.
but you talked a lot about staying within boundaries is kind of an important part of the Christian practice of anything.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. What are some of the tools or thought processes we can use to start to discern what, in concrete terms, those boundaries actually are?
Yeah.
What practices are or are not allowed?
Okay. Well, I think soil desertification and soil and the health of the soil is a big topic in agriculture. So if you want to look at agriculture, I think that's a helpful way to look. But it's not only in that realm. The whole package is we have creation in the soil, we have the animals or the produce that we create, and we have human beings, and all of them deserve to have a wholesome existence, and they are deeply interconnected. And so in terms of agriculture, I like to talk about soil and the loss of topsoil, because that's a very urgent issue, and that's where technology, I think, really pushes boundaries, and to an extent that I think is dangerous. In the history of humanity, civilizations have done that. The Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, there's a lot of desert in these areas, and that isn't by accident. So I find that helpful because it's a very current issue. In terms of our, spiritual life, how do we cultivate boundaries? That's an important question. There are levels in society, but in terms of agriculture, I find the soil question really important because it's very current. It taps into a lot of other things like climate change. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yes.
I'm going to make a big statement, and I just kind of want to hear your reaction to it. So I want to push back a little on your use of the word like large corporate farms and the negative connotation that comes with that, admitting I farm on what everyone here would probably consider a large corporate farm. And I unashamedly would say my main motivating goal is producing as many calories as cheaply and efficiently as possible. Now, obviously, I want to do that in a way that doesn't degrade
Yeah.
the soil, but that is my main motivation. And so I'll use corn as an example because I'm a corn farmer. I want to promote, I go to Mexican restaurants and they have this very unique, different blue corn that they make their corn tortillas on it, and I love and enjoy that diversity. But I feel like I'm playing a role in maintaining that by producing a very cheap, stable
Yeah.
food supply
Yeah.
that keeps the economy at a place that's healthy enough to support that kind of diversity.
Yeah.
And so how do we frame this conversation? Immediately I felt adversarial.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's not
Yeah.
productive because I agree with almost everything
Yeah.
you're saying.
Yeah.
And I want to be a part of the conversation discussion without
Yeah.
it being adversarial.
Yeah, and I think I'm so grateful that you're here and that we can have that dialogue because it's existential for you. You have a big farm. How do you I mean, I don't think your grandfather did. I don't know if probably your father had and you have, but your grandfather didn't, right?
No, it was more like my great-great-grandfather didn't, but yes.
Yeah. So in terms of food production, a big amount of the grains that are grown or the corn that are grown are actually not used to feed humans. A big amount of that is used to feed animals for meat production, and I think meat consumption is at a level that I don't think is sustainable. It's also used for producing fuels, ethanol, and it's also used for processed foods, which are not very healthy. And so I think we need to rethink those things. I think most food that is grown that humans eat is actually produced by smaller farmers. That doesn't mean that you don't produce grains and corn that's not used for food that humans eat, but a large amount isn't grown for that. So it's a very complex story that we are grappling with, if such a large amount is used to feed animals, and I'm going to come here to the nutrition part of it. We have a massive health crisis in the West. The Western diet, the Western diseases we're not in a good place. So traditionally, animals like chickens and pigs and cows didn't eat corn or grains or soy. Cows ate grass. Pigs ate a lot of other things, chickens roaming around, insects and all of that. For us as consumer, the end product is that we now eat meat that creates a great imbalance in terms of the polyunsaturated fats. The imbalance of, we used to have a balance of polyunsaturated fats, omega-3, omega-6 equal. We're now here, omega-6 here, omega-3 here. Now the research that's being done slowly but surely is linking that imbalance to neurodegenerative diseases and all kinds of inflammation diseases that a lot of us are struggling with. So I used to live with someone who researches omega-3s, and when I first moved in with her, I'm like, what is she talking about? And then since then, Michael Pollan has a more popular essay on it, but then there are books about that written, but now even people with heart disease, when they go to the doctor, they say, eat omega-3s. But you can't just pop a pill. That won't solve the problem because the imbalance is so great that we need to go back to a way of eating the way God designed it. Cows eat grass. That's why I go to Carl. My husband has some diseases that I'm very worried about, so I'm super anxious about getting, eggs from a farmer and meat because he doesn't eat fish, and fish has its own problems, to make sure that we have more of a balance of omega-3s and omega-6. So, like I said in the beginning, there's the soil, there are the animals and the grains, and then there's human health, and they're interconnected. And I just don't think the Western diet is sustainable. And I've had a nutrition expert come to my class, and that's what they say. There's something really wrong with the Western diet, and that's not a myth, that's scientifically proven. And so we need to ask, how did God design this world? How are we being kept healthy? And so the question, and I understand you're struggling, my family has some similar questions and struggles on how to survive, but also my sister and brother-in-law, they're a lot more traditional, while my nephew, who is now stepping in, is bringing more of the regenerative agriculture into the discussion. And there are some hot discussions happening on the winery. But coming from all sides, what we're doing is not sustainable. From the soil side, from the human health side, how we keep animals in the CAFOs, for example. I just don't, from a theological perspective, I have a lot of issues with that. It's not good for the environment in which they are. It's not good for the animals, but it's also not good for the people that have to work in them. So do we really have to eat so much meat? I'm not saying that you don't. I think Barbara Kingsolver, I don't know how many know her book, Animal, Vegetable, Miracle. She makes her argument for eating meat, but the whole system that we live in, I'm going to say very strongly, is not sustainable. And you just need to look at how many people have cancer, cardiovascular diseases. That's all. It's not only diet, but a big part of that is diet. It's we're in a tough spot, I think. And sometimes I just want to cry. I really do. I want to cry.
It's just, essentially, you need a theology of consuming, of what we purchase. Apparently, there are theological questions when you walk through the grocery store that most of us aren't aware of.
Yeah. We need new food laws. I actually teach about that. I teach about the food laws in the Old Testament. Obviously, I'm not talking about those food laws, but Michael Pollan has written a book about food rules that I use just to say we Christians have to think about new food laws that honors God and His creation. We have to think about that. This is not just sort of a secular matter. This is at the heart of who we are as God's people. And I'm a Lutheran, and Martin Luther always said, you take the gospel and you let it shine on the dark spots in your culture and society. So I, as a theologian, am called to think faithfully about the Christian gospel and then look, where are the dark spots and how can the gospel light shine on that? I think this is our vocation, and this is why I'm so thrilled that we're having this conversation, because it's really hard. And I come from, I, as a child, always fretted we're not going to make it. And I don't think it was as drastic, but I was always like, oh my gosh, we're not going to have enough food. We're not going to make it. I existentially worry about the weather. I know in my family, there was a tipping point where we thought we had to give up the winery. And the winery has been in our family for a long, long time. So I find it very difficult to talk about those things, because we're talking about the existence of farmers who have been told to do what they're doing, who have been pushed in that direction and who are subsidized in that direction. But I just ask questions about, is it sustainable?
Do you happen to know if Martin Luther was more of a beer drinker than a wine drinker?
I do. I'm a Lutheran. Katharina von Bora, the woman he married, escaped a Cistercian monastery. And it all comes back to the Cistercian, by the way. So she knew about agriculture, about herbs and everything. And so they started a commune, and Katharina had fields and really developed a small business. And she brewed beer, but they couldn't grow vines there. The climate wasn't suitable. So they had to rely on, Martin Luther was paid in wine, and they bought wine, and he loved his wine. Apparently he wrote A Mighty Fortress is Our God while he was sipping some Rhine wine. So he writes about that. How much beer he drank in contrast to how much wine, I don't know. But apparently Katharina was a really good beer brewer.
On that note, I think Gisela, so much for this presentation.